I'm getting the thumbs up. Can everybody in the back especially hear me? Wonderful. I'm seeing thumbs up. Okay. Do each want to test as well?
Testing.
Testing?
Testing.
Testing? Lovely. All right, we'll get started. So welcome, everybody. A conversation about navigating gender sensitivities in academia. I'm a brand new addition. Apologies if you were expecting Dr. Stefanie van der Peer from QMU. I am not Stefanie. My name is Dr. Megan Douglas. I work with the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program team at the University of Edinburgh, where I coordinate a joint doctoral program between Edinburgh and Wits University in South Africa. But I am very glad to be here and help facilitate this conversation. This is meant to be a conversational chat about the role of gender in academia, and we're joined by two very special guests, Professor Pamela Abbott from Aberdeen and Dr. Judy Wasige. And we're going to be discussing practices and assumptions in the academic sector while offering some hopefully concrete advice to young scholars on how to navigate equality, diversity, and inclusion trends in scholarship and academia. We're going to be engaging with the question, how do we address feminist issues in academia and research in a constructive and effective manner? And their research focuses on gender experiences in diverse cultures on the African continent. So they'll be able to draw inspiration from similar yet also diverse contexts, and as well suggest ways to approach a more sustainable gender balance in academia. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes, and then I would like to do a more thorough introduction to the others on the stage here. But there's no fire alarms planned, I meant to say. So if you hear a fire alarm, that is not a test. That means we need to exit. So please do follow the signs and the staff members. And the meeting point will be the Dome out on George Street, just a few buildings up the road, and you can't miss it. It's bedazzled in Christmas lights at the moment. And we really do want this to be an interactive session, so we encourage questions from the audience, both in the room and online. There will be a time where a staff member will pass around a microphone, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So I've introduced myself a little bit. I'd like to do a proper introduction to the others up here. Professor Pamela Abbott, first to my left, is the director of the Center for Global Development and a professor in the School of Education at the University of Aberdeen. Her research interests include socioeconomic and political development and transformations, well-being and quality of life, and gender. She has carried out research in the UK, Europe, the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, and North Africa, and East Africa. She's recently completed a 6-year project funded by the Scottish Government evaluating the use of the social practices approach for adult literacy and education in Rwanda, and a 3-year project funded by International Development Research Centre on the burden of unpaid care and domestic work in Rwanda. Since 2015, she has been researching socioeconomic and political developments in the MENA region following the 2010 uprisings funded by the European Union and the University of Aberdeen. She's currently leading research in Rwanda and Ethiopia, funded by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, exploring the potential for mindfulness to be integrated into the primary school curriculum to promote the mental health and well-being of children and adolescents. She was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2001 and is a member of the UKRI International Strategic Advisory Group. Welcome, Professor Abbott. Thank you. And to my right, I have Dr. Judy Wasige. Her work over the last 10 years has been to develop practical, theory-based evidence to support systemic processes to address the marginalization created and reinscribed in policy development and implementation in Scotland. Combining her wide experience in community activism and teaching, she has supported university students to critically conceptualize theory into practice. This work is particularly focused on anti-racism, decolonialization, it's been a long day, sorry, migration, transculturally responsive practice developed through Black feminist thought. Judy has largely developed expertise through supporting communities navigate their experiences of the systems, involvement in their lives related to education and harmful traditional practices. Judy further developed her pedagogical skills by integrating critical reflection, an intersectional framework, and co-production to facilitate more equitable, direct, and relevantly applied learning and practice. This work began as community activism and developed into academic activism. Welcome, Dr. Wasige. Fantastic. Okay. So we are going to just open up with a few different questions. And as I said, we'll start by me asking some questions to Dr. Abbott and Dr. Wasige, and then we'll have a time to open it up to the floor. But just opening with this question of gender and why is gender important? In life, of course, we can think about all the sensitivities and the nuances and understanding gender through different lenses, biology versus social transformation, or social constructivism, sorry. And in research as well, we're seeing this concept shift and take new meaning, but it's often not always prioritized because other aspects or variables are considered to be perhaps more important in different contexts around the world. So how do we change that in international collaborations?
Well, first of all, a lot of the research that's funded from the UK is funded by UK aid, and there's actually a legal requirement to consider gender. So you have to report on it, and you have to have a gender plan. So, in a sense, as young researchers need to think about that. However, I think it's important to remember that there's a big difference between taking account of gender in my research and feminism. They're not the same, and some of where we have perhaps to consider our own commitments. I have a very strong commitment to feminism. One of the first books I wrote was introducing feminist sociology in the UK. At the time, the University of Brighton had a three stack bookcase where they had all their feminist research books or all their gender research books, right? So, and it wasn't that long ago. So I have a very strong commitment, but we have to navigate that. So gender equality, or actually it was called women's equality, which came onto the agenda, I guess as recently as the 1980s. I'm old enough to remember when patriarchy was alive and well, to a much greater extent in the UK than it is now, as I'm often tell my colleagues in Rwanda and other African countries. So, but when it first came onto the agenda, it was women's equality, and it was about a liberal view, for those of you at social scientists. So it was about women becoming more like men. And of course, that solves nothing. And one of the things that I think women globally will tell you, so it's not just in Africa, but certainly the people who I work with in Rwanda and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, certainly the research data that they collect when I'm working in partnership with them has it as well. And that is what all that does is adds to women's burden, right? The World Bank push earning a salary, but it doesn't empower women because they usually earn less than the men they're living with, and it certainly doesn't give them any immediate relationships. So I think, so women in Rwanda have often, in the data that we've collected, said, well, we used to look after the fields, and we looked after the kids, and we looked after the home, and we did the cooking and the shopping. And now we're told, you're equal to men, you've got to be equal to men. So they expect us to go out and earn some money before. And I remember another group of women, and I was actually there at this one, who said, Well, look at us. We look old before our time. Look at our husbands. Look how young and handsome they still look. So there's issues around what gender equality means. On the other hand, when we get to the other end with feminism, the problem is that feminism is about transformation. It's about changing the relationship between men and women so that they have equal power, because gender's a power relationship, like class and ethnicity. They're power relationships. So women are subordinated within in those relationships. And that's difficult, and that's where the challenges come. Until comparatively recently, not me, I've never written it. I'm not denying that I agree with it, but have written about Rwanda, which is often sort of held up as the beacon of gender equality in sub-Saharan Africa, that they wanted gender equality without feminism. So they wanted to say, and that's very, I have to say that at government level now in Rwanda, the policy, 2019, and from then on, they've recognized that, and they are now talking about gender transformation. But that's where the other rub comes, is that they're even in countries that have got progressive gender legislation, Rwanda, Morocco, Tunisia, so it's not just in sub-Saharan Africa. And most of the countries have signed up to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So there's often gender legislation, but that doesn't mean that attitudes and values in the villages have changed. When the land law in Rwanda changed. So what married women now, I won't go into the technicalities of the law because it's a bit more complicated than that, are joint owners of the land that was brought to the marriage by both partners, and their names are on the title deeds because they had tithing, so all the land is now properly registered. But when we talk to the women, they say, well, my name's on the land certificate, but my husband still really owns it. And so that was intended to empower women so they could have decisions over the land, but that hasn't done so. I've gone off-piste, I think, from what you were saying, but I think, how do we make certain genders there? I'll make one point and then I'll let Judy come in. Oxfam have a hierarchy, which I think is really nice. So they have, at the bottom of the ladder is gender harming research. So they say if we don't look at gender at all, if we don't just collect data to look at whether men and women, boys and girls are different, then that's harming because we're not even aware of what the issues are. And then their ladder goes all the way up to gender transformational research. Not all research is going to be gender transformational, but it's important to think about gender in the same way as we should think about race and sexuality as an important difference, because if we don't, it can actually have harmful outcomes.
Thank you.
Okay. So,
Thanks, Pamela. I think you've actually almost preempted what I've considered here. And I'd just like to say I'm also an early careers researcher, still trying to navigate these spaces. And most of my experience is really from the community perspective. And therefore, the work I do work with an organization called, I'm one of the directors of Kenyan Women in Scotland Association, and then also work with young people in just trying to ensure, because I've lived in Scotland for quite a long time, and it's how do we integrate into these communities and explore questions, for example, of gender in a safe way, because when we think about these issues from an African perspective, these are almost issues of taboo. Like, it's not something you want to be, coming to carry out any research and saying, we want gender equality. It's a matter of coming in and navigating the landscape and learning how to create the relevant partnerships and trying to understand the vocabulary to use in order to access the communities and actually get any meaningful, if you'd like to say, change or meaningful learning from any of the work that we'd like to do. So it's initially really an emotive issue because women in Africa, and this has been in the literature for a long time, actually carry the burden of the labor in Africa and a range of issues we experience, but speaking loudly about the issue of, for example, gender equality when we are speaking about feminism is another issue altogether. And when we navigate away from gender from a feminist perspective, there's a whole range of gender characteristics now. And these are generally being explored, there's research being done about this, but you'd never know if you went into the communities that this research is actually being carried out. And when we even think about the question of feminism as well, what is feminism to these communities? We all have different perspectives, and I think there's a cultural slant to it. What we mean when we are talking about feminism to women who this have a whole range of issues, as Pamela was alluding to, about how to get the next meal on the table. And so, as I said, I'm really new and really trying to carefully navigate what that means. And for those communities that live in Scotland, for example, I've worked around the area, for example, of female genital mutilation. And the way female genital mutilation is perceived in Scotland, the way it's explored, the way the government policy is written, does not resonate with the women who actually live in these communities. And however much you try to influence policymakers' perspectives, in the end, it's talk, and whatever the policy outcomes are, do not always resonate with our communities. So I think this is a really difficult area where the cultural nuances are really meaningful, and how do we then get to actually speak to women and come to almost get that vocabulary, a shared vocabulary that can help whoever is on the table with the range of cultures. Even with FGM, there's so many communities that practice FGM. For each one of them, it has a different meaning. And so how do we come to the table as women, bring our men, to the conversation to ensure that the outcomes actually are, have a social justice focus. And I think these are some of the issues I'm trying to explore, even from a public health perspective, because I do lecture now in public health as well. So lots to think about, and really, I would say, just as the title there, navigating, I think is the right word about this. How do we navigate and, get the right vocabulary and the right outcomes for all communities, women, men, children, all involved? Yeah, that's what I would say.
Well, Dr. Wasige, I really appreciate your humility and your openness and curiosity, and I think those are traits that all of us need to maintain as we do navigate these difficult subjects. And this topic of feminism or feminisms has already come up, and you were talking about sort of epistemologies of these concepts. And so I'm just curious, when we think about feminism and your understanding of the word and also historically how that has changed so much over time, what has your experience and your own research been in using the terminology around feminism or feminisms? Has it been a useful term in your experience? Perhaps we'll start again with you, Professor Abbott.
No, I don't think I found feminism a useful term in research, and I think all my research is done in what I hope are equitable partnerships. Sometimes I'm the junior partner, or I'm the support, not the lead. Sorry, I'm fiddling. Right. So I mean, one of the problems I've encountered is working with men who are much more likely to be the researchers. I mean, that's one issue about doing research, trying to make sure you have women on the research team. Women haven't historically had the opportunities to do the PhDs and become senior in the universities or in local consultancy agencies. So quite often I've ended up working with the researchers still being men, and I've had to insist we get data collectors in. You can't send, you two can't go and ask women when they were last had domestic violence was in their household or something. So I think that's an issue. But one of the problems is that the men I've worked with, young men, bright, are not even particularly committed to gender equality. So I mean, the housework one we were doing, and I just said something I'd read in the literature, which was that people in Rwanda and other African countries had said that gender equality had gone too far. And they both said, yes, yes, yes. Right, so there's lots of sensitivities. It can almost start with working with your research team. How do you get them? Actually, those two have now moved quite a long way. And one of them had previously started paying his wife because his wife was in Uganda. And he came to Rwanda because he could earn more in this research consultancy firm. And I said, well, who's looking after your business, which was renting out housing in Kampala? He said, my wife. And I said, oh, she just does it. He said, yeah. I said, well, shouldn't you pay her a wage? And he did actually start paying her a wage. So I'm being perhaps nastier about him than I should be. But that is an issue. And another big issue, I think, for us now, if we're doing the research from the UK, is all the requirements around safeguarding, because that means we've got to be alert to issues like female genital domestic violence, even when that's not part of anything we're researching. Right? So once we get into the safeguarding, which comes from the Oxfam. The Oxfam events, and that's really very much something we have to do from UK universities now, and even explaining that to colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa. My current project, we have a safeguarding policy, reporting rules, and everything in place, but it took us 6 months or so to actually talk them through it and get them to understand it. They're not very strong about it, stronger than I am, I think. But it's these things are there. Yeah, I mean, so there's all. I've forgotten what the question was, but one last point. The other point is that. Is treading the path between our responsibility of researchers for people on the research team, not just the people we're interviewing, and what our colleagues would see as acceptable behaviour. So things that happened here in the UK in the 50s and 60s, into the 70s, academics sleeping with their students is still, I've been with a research team where the male researchers are eyeing up which of the research assistants they're going to try and sleep with. And you're in a very difficult position. What do you do about that? Because our response will be we're all consenting adults. So there's all sorts of issues around doing research, which we need to be really aware of. Sorry, I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, these are complicated questions, and I think they deserve complicated answers. So thank you very much. And Dr. Wasige, I'm wondering, and I can, I mean, it was a messy question to begin with, but if you have a sense of how you'd like to respond, go for it.
Yeah, it's complicated. And the first question, or first perhaps thought I'd like to, or question I'd like to ask is, why am I an early careers researcher at this age? Like, how did that happen? And when I start thinking about my, life journey, then it becomes really clear because we first, moved to Europe around, I'll just tell some stories, about 30 years ago. And my husband got a scholarship to study in Germany at that time. And so we came, the scholarship was quite comprehensive. It had a family package to that. So I then did, managed through that because of the education system in Germany, managed to do my PhD as well, my master's, degree at that time. And the first thing I'd actually like to say, because of the conversations that have gone on today, is the type of education that we have, in our systems and the education we have here. I feel that that really raised my consciousness about what education is and why what it should do to our environment, what we need to change our environments because of what we know. But that's the kind of education on the African continent is still today the banking model, where you have to, just keep doing the next, degree and next whatever qualification there is, without really considering or without the relevance to the environment in which, the education is taking place. And so that really excited me. I started thinking about all the things. Why does, for example, why do the women in the village still go to the river miles away to fetch water when we've had education I come from Kenya for, so many, more than 50 years at that time? Why can't we change our environment because of the education we've had? And why do women still carry the burden of these communities? Okay, so when I went back to, to home, we finished it was about 5 years that we were in Germany, and I went back to Kenya. I was really, charged with trying to change my communities, trying to change the way people understood the world around them. And so I started, writing grant applications. I wrote to the USAID and Japanese, whatever I could see anyone, giving funding or having funding streams available. I did apply for that and wanted to start making a change. But at the same time, then my husband, got a job, to come to Glasgow Uni, and so he'd finished and he's able to, progress. But there I was in that situation whereby I couldn't move, and then the academic, environment here as well does not really understand that when we are bringing people to this country, it's families. These are fathers who are coming, you're bringing to a country. They have wives, they have children. And what are the wives going to do? I was an early careers researcher who had to stop my career at that time. And it's only like 20 years later that I've now managed to, break into academia, because I did try a few times. I even tried going to an EDD program, Doctor of Education program. But what happened was that at the beginning of that program, there were about 10 women. We were about 10 women on it. And by the end of the first year, we remained just 2 of us. And what the women kept saying was that it was family responsibilities, that they couldn't carry on. So there you go. What is it that, keeps us behind? And why do we still keep exploring this feminism question? And so when I was doing my, PhD as well, that's one of the questions I asked. And I did convene. I used action learning and action research as part of my, field work. And part of the questions the women wanted to ask was, what is feminism? And so we went away, and each woman, took a different topic. and there were 14 feminisms that everyone was exploring. And in the end, it wasn't very clear how it related to their own contexts. So all these feminisms out there, how do they relate to the African context? Because I do work with African communities. So that's the question I'm still asking up to today. And if anything, that's something I would like to explore even further. How do we make that relevant to the women on the continent? And then I did see that some women, I think in Nigeria, had done some work around this feminism question and have come up with a few approaches. For me, what still resonated with me from all the range of that was Black feminist thought, and I think that's why I still have it as part of my work. But yeah, it's complicated. I mean, what do we experience on a day-to-day basis? How can we relate that to this question of feminism? And how does that relate to our own communities and our own context? Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
And thank you for bringing it back to the personal, because so oftentimes these concepts can just sort of remain in the conceptual realm. But at the end of the day, it's really us and our bodies. And thank you for bringing it back to this notion of Black feminism. But you said that there was 14 different feminisms that had been brainstormed.
Yeah, there wasn't just, okay, there were many more, but because we were 14 in that action,
yes.
So we explored those
exactly.
14 different,
I love that.
Yeah,
Such a fantastic illustration of, you could have a different understanding for every person in the room.
I mean, I'm not sure I agree. There's lots of definitions of feminism, because for me, feminism is about transformation and really, really, really equality. But I think perhaps let's reflect how important that is to us as researchers. Most of us aren't going to do feminist research. We're not all feminist researchers. We're not going to look at the world through that lens. That doesn't mean that we ignore gender inequalities or anything like that. But we have to think where our research lies as researchers without ignoring differences. I mean, there's other really sensitive issues that perhaps we should be raising as well, which is about sexuality. Yeah, and I mean, the issues around that, I don't want to, I mean, I'm happy to talk about it and my experience in Rwanda, but so we have to think how we navigate it. I think the other thing we haven't mentioned is Africa's a huge continent, and it has lots of different cultures. There's lots of different relationships between genders. So some societies are matriarchal. That doesn't mean the mothers have the power, but it does have a twist. We've got particularly the North African countries. We've got Egypt and Libya, where there's particularly where gender is very difficult to navigate. And then you've got countries like Tunisia, Morocco, which have both now got progressive legislation, and in the towns, there's probably some acceptance of gender equality, but the countryside is still very traditional, and how you navigate that and how you can do your research and talk to men and talk to women and collect the data. So I think one of the things that's really important about doing research is the context, and we need to understand that context and the way gender is there. And I think also, as a white British fairly elderly researcher, I can't go out, I have never, no, that's untrue, but I've done research in a large number of countries. I have never collected data apart from interviewing in Rwanda, because they all speak English, senior government officials, and I've lived and worked there long enough that it wasn't an issue. But So I think we have to be led as well by our African partners. This is where elements of equitable partnership come in. So we've got to challenge as well. I mentioned challenging men, but also we've got to work with them and work out what's possible. And then there's just good research practice, interviewing women separately from men, making certain that interviews are confidential. Yeah. And giving people space and accepting that some things people even knowing it's confidential may not be willing to discuss. So a lot of what we need to think about, I think, is good research practice.
And on that note of, I think, contextualization, so again, just going back to that question around Black feminisms, is that a helpful distinction between Black and white feminisms?
Well, all these concepts are, culturally developed, and of course there'll be distinctions in how this was conceptualized, and I think Pamela alluded to that initially it was about separating men from women, and Black feminism tends to lean towards more holistic approaches where it's not the separation, but it's about bringing everybody on board. And yes, we want equality, gender equality, but in the end, we don't want to break families. How do we continue discussing the different, perhaps, requirements that children need, men need, but in the end remain as a family unit? And I think there's a lot, or there's an integration of intergenerational learning, whereby you want to ensure that there's that continuity, organization of community from not just one generation. It's not just about one say middle class, or it's everybody, whoever is perhaps making the tea, and everyone has a role in to play in the, if it's research, whatever organization it is, whatever initiative, that move together, everyone moves together. So that's the differences that I saw there, really. But I guess everything is changing, and we cannot, whoever conceptualized this 20 years ago, I think things have changed even today, and it might be, there's differences from where it all started. Yeah.
I think at this point, I would love to now open it up to the room. And if there's anybody here that's a PhD student or considers themselves an early career researcher, or at any stage in your academic journey, I think it'd be fantastic now to hear some questions, some thoughts you have. We've, of course, already covered many different kind of topics and themes around already positionality and epistemologies, around kind of the vocabularies that we're using and whether they're useful or not. And so I think at this time, if anybody has any questions, comments, if you would like to share your own experiences, Eva has a microphone and is happy to pass it around.
Hi, guys. Just thought I'd ask a quick question before I dash to the loo. I have a thought. I'm early careers researcher as well. Have had to stop studying to travel to the diaspora and manage and do things, and doing a master's with UHI on contemporary art and archaeology at the moment. So when I was looking at my research, there came up this feminism thing, and I said, oh God, am I really a feminist? Do I have to write to this? Why are they making me do this? I don't want to be this called a feminist thing, because I'm not. And then I started feeling really guilty about this, and I was like, why am I feeling guilty about not quite being a feminist? So that definition of feminism is really important, I feel. And I think it is a cultural thing. And but then the complexity is when you have both. So you're in the diaspora, and your mind has changed, and you've become quite westernized, and you expect your husband to cook as well. Whereas, so it's quite a tricky one because it is about time and place and nuance. And I know particularly in Zimbabwe, the FGM stuff is recommended, and you do feel kind of like not quite ready for all that mating stuff unless you have had that done. So, and then people really promote it. Women really promote it. So in Zimbabwe, people promote that type of whatever happens. And then you come here and then you're told, no, you don't do that. That's the Western construct. So I think there's two things to look at. It's just about place. In the diaspora, there's a lot of shifts in cultural ways, and those have impacted on families and stuff. And I think also this idea of feminism, I don't know, I don't quite, I understand the construct of professional feminism, but I think there's also domestic feminism. You know what I mean? I think there's quite a couple of ways of looking at it, but I don't know where I am with either because I just, I don't want to do the heavy work.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we can certainly get another. I'm just curious, would either of you like to respond to any of that? No?
I think you're right. It's complex, and each one of us is on a journey. And you are right in talking about context and place. And I really kind of understand why you keep changing your positionality. Like one day you think I'm this, or why should I be a feminist, and so on. But I think when you're talking about the professional, is it about gender pay gap and things like that?
I mean, I definitely think it's possible to make a distinction between gender equality and feminism. Yeah. Feminism is political. It sees an inequality between men and women, a power inequality, and that's what it wants to change. And the problem is that the rhetoric has got mixed. So you have the World Bank talking about feminism, they call gender equality, empowerment of women. But as I tried to say quite early on, women going out to work and earning a bit of money, which is then what the World Bank advocate, will not transform their lives and give them more power in the family. The EU claims in its policies that it promotes feminism, but it's actually still women's equality. I mean, I've read all the documents because I've written a book where I analyse the documents. So, the policies. So I think, we need to be clear what we're talking about, and that's why I said, lots of researchers will do research where feminism isn't germane to what they're doing. Lots of researchers remain possibly post-positivists, but think that their values shouldn't influence their research. Feminism is research where women actually do think that their political views. It's about, if you like, transforming the world rather than describing the world. So these debates about gender equality and feminism, also for us as, certainly for social science researchers, are also part of our theoretical frameworks. So that's important. I think that research should be about improving people's lives. In my case, women, whoever, women, children, but that isn't the view of all social scientists and psychologists and things as well. Economists. So so I think that's we need to be really aware of that, and what we're trying to say about what research should do, to the extent to which gender should always be part of our research, recognising that there are gender differences, but recognising that when we come to talk about feminist research, we're talking about bringing values into research. And that's a greatly disputed area among social scientists.
Yes, hello. There was an online question. Trauma-informed research design, contextual safeguarding, and rights advocacy supports are fundamental infrastructure which should be the foundations for any equitable research partnerships in 2024. Where are you seeing this infrastructure put into practice in Scottish research partnerships?
I think
I didn't hear it.
You might need just you can repeat that again a bit. Is that okay?
Yeah? Can you hear me? Oh.
Okay. Sorry, I can read it. No, it's tricky to hear.
Your microphone.
Okay.
It's a question.
Yes. Would you like to go ahead, and then we can hear from Professor Abbott?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and also really helpful, because these are concepts that I try to also integrate in the work I do. If you think about racialization and racism, for example, this is trauma. Racism is trauma. And anytime we're going to be researching racialization and racism, it's talking to people with lived experience, for example. It's them relieving that trauma. So I think integrating this concept into research today, I think, becomes really, really important, because without them, then we are actually doing more harm to these communities than any good, because at the end of the day, yes, these are lived experiences that people have gone through. We want to learn from these experiences, and it becomes important to create safe spaces. And creating a safe space includes, for example, a trauma-informed approach to that. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Well, I mean, I think I've already said this, but about safeguarding, I'll repeat it. Following the Oxfam scandal in 2018, both the Scottish government and the UK-wide government put in place requirements that for any projects or research that had development funding, which most of the research when we do it, had to have safeguarding in place. The universities have to have research in safeguarding policies, which are different from the safeguarding from the 2010 legislation, which is about incapacity. And we have to do risk of harm protocols. It's evolving. I'm not saying every researcher. My university has only just got its policy in place. I know that Glasgow and Edinburgh have had policies in place for a lot longer. We're now required, UKR&I, which is what funds domestic research in the UK, as well as, well, it does fund some development research in Africa as well. They now have a requirement that if the universities want any of their funding, they must have safeguarding in research policies. But there's a capacity building, right? I don't know how many researchers across Scotland are aware, even of their university safeguarding policies. It's still really evolving in Aberdeen, or even understand the safeguarding policies and what they're about. And it's not something you can learn in 5 minutes. You have to have risk of harm protocols in place. You have to have policies in place. We had to get whistleblowing policies passed in Rwanda and Ethiopia, our partners, so that people could make reports anonymously. We had to put in place reporting procedures. You've got a 22-year-old university student doing a survey, and he's interviewing, or she's interviewing, because it wouldn't be a man, a woman who is saying, who discloses that she's really frightened about when her husband comes home tonight because she's upset him and he's gone drinking and she's worried he's going to beat her up. That 22-year-old researcher now, under safeguarding requirements, has to do something about it, but he can't do anything. So you have to have a procedure. He has to know who he phones. Who he phones has to know who ultimately makes the decision. I'm doing research, the Ethiopian research I'm doing, we've got questionnaires, my current project, where we are using what I call malaise scales or screening tests for depression. They're not diagnostic, but they're screening. There isn't really mental health services in Rwanda and Ethiopia, and yet we're going to find quite high proportion of people we interview, particularly the women with children, will be on the part of that scale that suggests that they should be properly tested for mental health. Now, my partner's a psychiatrist in Ethiopia, and we're working out at what point we report, who we can report to, because there is just such a lack of service. So absolutely, safeguarding is absolutely central to research. And we're required to safeguard our own research team, junior researchers, both from people they might be interviewing and from other members of the team. We have to safeguard our participants in our research, but also bystanders. There's an expectation that you do that. So it's really important, and I think we are working towards it in Scotland, but it will take time.
I can just, give an example from the work around FGM, because that's one of the areas I've worked around. And when we began community engagement in Scotland, I think it suddenly became an issue, and it became like almost fashionable for community organizations to do work around this issue. And in many cases, they didn't even prepare the women to come to meetings. And it was, terrible to watch women breaking down because they think they are strong enough to come to these meetings, but when they arrive in the meetings, they can't even speak, asked to stand up, and because this hasn't been taken into consideration. And it happened so many times that I feel that experience for me alone just says how important safeguarding is, that people have had, trauma, they've been traumatized, they've gone through these experiences, yet we want to extract data from them. And in so doing, we actually don't realize that they're reliving this trauma again, and therefore the need to ensure that really the framework within which we're working has taken this into consideration. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just say, I think we've given attention for a long time to training interviewers so they're aware of how they handle it if someone becomes upset in interviews and things. What's new is this thing about referring people and that, which is and protecting people. So people participating in our research. So I think that's new, but that doesn't mean that every research team does train people properly.
And I guess it's also about realizing that when we are working with these groups of people, we're actually more or less extracting their knowledge and skills and their time. And it becomes really important when we are designing any project to ensure that they're properly perhaps remunerated, to ensure that, because many times people miss shifts, they miss work to come to, this kind of work. And if you think about it, it's potentially just the researcher who's being paid at the time, you're doing this work, yet they're working so hard, they've left whatever it is they're doing to come into, to do this research with you. So it becomes really important to consider the whole framework, including making sure, you have arrangements around childcare and all these things that make, women feel safe, if not just women, anybody else who's had an experience around trauma, or you're trying to get data from them. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation so far. Like, you've given me so many things to think about, and I promise I'm going to try as best as possible to consolidate my thoughts, and I'll try doing that in the form of 2 questions. I'm a PhD researcher. I'm from Tanzania, and so I think by virtue of that, I'm going to be a bit biased and direct my questions to Dr. Judy, because I think you'll be more familiar with the lived experience and context of it all. So the first one is around the navigation of gender sensitivities. And I'm asking this from the positionality of you being trained in the Global North and working in a Global North institution, and then going back to Kenya and collecting data and doing research there, in the sense, on one aspect, you're on this, I could say, position of power as a knower in your field, and then you go back to Kenya where it's more you're a woman first before you're seen as a knower in your field. And I'm just asking, how do you navigate these cultural issues, for instance, of hierarchy and, requirements for almost this submissiveness to men and the people around you, and balancing that in such a way that these cultural requirements or dictates, rather, almost don't hijack your research, in trying to shape the direction or what exactly you can get out of it. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but point is, and you touched on this, but balancing those power dynamics where, okay, I'm an expert in my field and I'm trying to get this type of data, but at the same time, I'm faced with these cultural constraints which somehow force me to move in a certain way, but still, you need to still be able to exercise a level of control and management of those dynamics. That's one. And then my second question would be on, I think the issue of feminism in African countries, I'll speak for Tanzania, is quite tricky because it's not necessarily a men versus women issue. Women ourselves are not monolith in what we expect of feminism, gender equality. I'm not an expert in the distinctions between the two, but yes, in a sense, some women, despite their level of education or economic status, still hold issues as motherhood quite close to their chest, and for them, doing extra, what is seen as unpaid labor in the home and everything is a source of pride and joy to them. And so when you tell them about, feminism, this and that, it's something that they don't resonate with, even though they're educated and so forth. And then there are others who do know that and would like to get out of it, but I think knowingly or unknowingly, because of the pushback and almost the ostracization that they face, they somehow adapt their preferences and feel, and I'm not saying that's what's happening in this context, but no, I'm not a feminist, to almost put themselves in a safe corner. So I guess my question is choice. How can most women in Africa freely exercise their choice and be empowered in their choice, whatever version of feminism seems to work for them, and navigate that pushback instead of somehow feeling pressure to adapt their preferences to a certain version of feminism or gender equality or whatever it is, in fear of that retaliation? I hope I've been able to consolidate my thoughts as much as possible, but yes, really insightful talk and so many wonderful things to think about.
Thank you. That's quite loaded question, but thank you. I think the most important thing that I see from the work I do is methods. and how do we ensure that we work with, I'm a community engaged researcher, and I do a lot around participatory research, and it's about whichever work that we would like to do, ensuring that we work with communities right from the start, if possible from proposal writing to the end to data analysis, co-analysis with the communities. So how we do that, relationship building is really important, and in building reflection throughout these processes to ensure that we are learning throughout the process and that we actually more or less, first of all, when we're going out, the work we're doing, we need to ensure that it's actually going to benefit the communities more than us, and that it's about social justice, and therefore we want to empower, emancipate the women, or whichever group it is you're working with, such that they emerge as agents of social change in their own communities. Okay, so the work we're doing is not for you, it's not for your research, it's for the communities, such that they become agents of change within their own communities. So having relationship building, really, really important, that the communities have confidence, they trust you, first of all, and once you've done that, that every stage of the work, you always have critical reflection, and then making sure that you have a group whereby who can ask meaningful questions through that reflection, so that it's a learning process for everybody. And then another thing that would help build that trust is recognizing any small wins that there are through this journey, to ensure that, whatever little it is, and these communities like to do a lot, is celebrate, come together, have a meal together, do something together to show that there's a milestone that's been achieved. So if you can reflect on throughout the process, and then also, ensure that you're celebrating those small wins, I think you kind of bring everybody together and they learn to trust you. And what I say is that when we go to such groups, for example, you can start off, we're going in as co-researchers because they know so much more about their own context than you do. And therefore, it's a matter of you learning from them. It's not you going to teach them anything. They are not vessels, empty vessels to be taught. They actually have lots of experience, lots of knowledge. And if anything, the questions you're asking, it's their resilience that's the solution to the problem you're asking or the questions you're asking. So go out as, with a mind of them being co-researchers with you and not you being the researcher. So if you do that, you can get a backlash if you're going to say you're going to show them what they need to know, because we need to be looking for the solutions from them and doing the work with them, and not at the, talking at them and, making, but I think it was one of the last group in the afternoon where we were talking about partnerships, about communication, about collaboration, doing everything at the same time together. And then also making sure that, there's the idea of character building, because there's a lot of things that would be going on, around understanding what honesty is, trust, and all these things, to ensure that at the end of the project, we've actually learned together, we've grown together, and therefore it becomes their project, it becomes their learning and their knowledge. So I think in that way, you should be able to, get a good outcome out of a project, rather than going in as, yes, I'm the expert, I have, the power. Though that power balance is really, really important in making sure that you blur the lines between researcher, participant. And I hope that that's actually answering both your questions in a way, because, or is that enough?
No, it's quite good. It's quite good. I really like the co-researcher.
Yeah, yeah.
That humility of you learning from them. Yeah, I can definitely see how that will smoothen the road for a lot of the obstacles that I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you so much for such an enlightening and sensitive conversations regarding gender. And when I think about feminism, I'm careful to hold myself out to say, look, I'm a feminist, because it's been overflogged. And there is a thin line between good and evil. some representation of feminism has been misconstrued as being evil, being an evil woman, disrespectful to the husband, and such, the likes of that. But Dr. Judy, when you shared about your story, I was just here critically reflecting, and I would like to quickly give a brief background so that you would understand where my question is coming from. I'm Nigerian from an African background, and I come from a family of all girls. Growing up, my parents, especially my dad, was seriously warned not to send us to school because your degree, your name is just going to end up being changed. You're going to take up your husband's name. His name is going to be forgotten. It's as good as just wasting money. But thank goodness it did not listen to them. Today, I'm a postdoctoral assistant professor in law, Robert Gordon University. Thank God for that. But my question is coming from this misconstrued. It's still ongoing, and some people keep taking that really seriously to say, look, come to think of it, they make a good point. You're going to get married, and it's just, the Nigerian African mentality is still there. It lingers on. It comes in different version, even though, this is 2024, we all know of the United Nations Sustainable Goal, Agenda 2030 is still there. Trust me when I say it's still there. So my question comes from, how do we sort of achieve some sort of consensus, or should I convergence, with regards to having a policy that is centered to foster gender equality from a consensus point of view without leaving anyone behind? It looks like a really tough one, because especially looking at people from the underrepresented group that are often marginalized. How do we talk about gender equality, gender sensitivity from this holistic lens, and also with regards to the policy implementation part of it, without leaving anyone behind? Thank you.
Would like to go first?
I think this is a matter that communities need to explore together, to raise awareness together, and take a holistic approach together. Because there's a lot of disjointedness about what our understanding of feminism is. So unless we begin with a conversation where we begin asking the questions together and developing whatever, be it theory or whatever it is, from these conversations to ensure that whatever we come up with is reflective of our perspectives as a community, I think there's a huge issue there. And I think this afternoon we had the idea about transnational partnerships as well. Communities are increasingly more transnational now, because much as we live in the UK, most of us still watch African TV. Most of us still eat African food, and so we still maintain our cultures. And that's why you find that our men will still, and I think this is one thing that we really often, I think, don't get right, is because once we feel that perhaps we are now emancipated, we want to move away from our cultures, and we've got new learning, and perhaps our men haven't moved with us, and that means that we leave them behind or whatever it is. I think it's something that we need to come together as communities, not just the women. We need to know what our men's perspectives are. We need to know what our children's perspectives are, so that we move we move forward together. Because it cannot be that a group of people decide that this is what feminism means to them and then impose it on you. And all these concepts have been developed through research, through people coming together to have a discussion, a debate, and then, that's how we, have the concepts accepted by certain communities, or even values and beliefs, develop as a matter of relationship building and conversations as well. So it's not an easy thing from my perspective. It's something that we all need to, make our hands dirty with, come in, have the conversations, and from that, then, have a shared understanding about these concepts. Yeah.
I think we need to separate our politics. And I say that as someone who thinks you can't really do it, but anyway, from research. So not all research, if we're thinking of the research questions we're asking, requires a feminist perspective. So a feminist sociologist may, and I'm a feminist and I'm a sociologist, but I'm not a feminist sociologist. I don't just do feminist research. So take two recent projects I've worked on. The Unpaid Care Work project was funded by the Canadian equivalent of UK aid, right? And it was funded as gender transformative research, right? They funded several countries to do the research. They wanted research done that would come up with gender transformative ways that the unfair distribution of unpaid care and domestic work happens in families. You know, I said right at the beginning, UK everywhere, globally, it's a huge problem. Women have 3, sometimes 4 jobs, men have 1. And you can think of that, let me just explain, because you may think, well, how can a woman have 4 jobs, right? She's got her paid job, which is now globally more or less expected of women, right? She's got her own domestic work, her own family. She's possibly got elderly parents or parents-in-law that she's doing care for, and possibly grandchildren as well. So that might, you know, so, and men tend just to do their paid work. Now, when the biggest burden is when children are young, and men often work very long hours, and we have to think about all that. But we were asked to come up with, so that had to be feminist research. We were doing research to come up with so it was informed by feminist theory and gender and the solution. We know what the solution is, but you do the research and the funder's happy. They've got it yet again. Childcare writ large, right? Because the men are working. They can't do more housework. And that's what our research in Rwanda showed. The research I'm doing now about mindfulness and children in school, yes, we're looking to see whether there are differences by age, by gender, by all sorts of criteria. It may have some elements of being gender transformative because women tend to suffer much more from depression than men. And so if the mindfulness works, then that can be very important for women. But it's not feminist research in the sense that the unpaid care work was feminist. And just so you, because I'm going to say it, right, I've had to read, I'm not a psychologist, I knew nothing about mindfulness when I got the grant for this project. I had people who did on my team. Unfortunately, for different reasons, we don't have them anymore. But I have now read about 300, the reports on about 300 trials on mindfulness. And it wouldn't get published in social, it's all in peer-reviewed journals. It wouldn't get published in sociology journals, most of it. They don't look to see whether it's had a different impact on boys. They look at age sometimes, but very little of gender. So that's what I mean by gender-harming research, research that doesn't even take account of gender, says, are there gender differences? Are there, you know, whatever differences are important in the context that you're working. So there's a sort of differences in research. There's differences by people's epistemological and ontological stances about research, whether they're positivist, whether they're constructivist, whether they're critical realist, for those of you who understand what I'm talking about. And there's different views among researchers as to and that sometimes goes with those differences. I'm a critical realist. One element of critical realism, ethical research, that research should be about improving people's lives. But positives would say, rules of science, we're detached researchers. No, I don't think they can be, but they just haven't told us what their values are. But they do their research like that. But we can all make certain we take account of gender and gender issues. And the one thing we haven't really talked about, that we make sure women become researchers, that women get the training, that it's not just men. When I was first working in Rwanda, I think the most senior woman in a university was at lecturer level. You know, all the profs, all the senior lecturers, the deans, everyone were men. So that's important as well in working in research in Africa, is ensuring gender, well, can't always have gender equality in our research teams, but at least that we include women, and we include women in senior positions as well as training positions, and that we give them the same opportunities as the male researchers to publish and progress their careers.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult to separate the research aspect from the political, and I think I would even prefer to call myself an academic activist because I would like to see outcomes from the work I do in the communities as well. So it's not about just doing the research for research's sake. And I think there's studies that have been done, especially for people from marginalized communities, that we do research to change our communities. It's not about doing some, really high-level abstract thinking. And I think most of us from marginal, because of our life course experiences, really is that I'm doing this to actually change what I'm seeing in my communities, and therefore that activist part becomes really important. And so there are all those nuances there, and from the work I do in most cases, I'm part in the community and part also, doing the research aspect of it. But I would, enjoy more the activist part of it, where you actually do the research, get the findings, and make sure that policymakers have actually seen the data and the changes happening at the same time. So, yeah.
Just to make a point, we've not really talked about, I mean, I mentioned Egypt and countries like that, the Muslim countries, but there's much greater difficulty in those countries. In Egypt, for example, they still teach women and men in separate classes. One of my former PhD students was saying, I have to work long hours because I have to give the lecture to the women and the men separately. So, and of course he's not seen, or he can't see the women when he gives, he may in Egypt, but in Saudi Arabia, for example, which is outside Africa, I know, the male lecturers can't see the female students when they're teaching them. Students can see the men. So, so there's sensitivities there, and we have to be aware of them. I got told in one Muslim country to put it was boiling hot, to put a jacket on because it was offensive for my arms to be bare to the men. So, and we have to navigate how we're prepared to engage with that. I sometimes feel very edgy, about you must wear. I had to wear the full regalia in Saudi Arabia when I did a university inspection. Are you prepared to do that? Because that's quite. I didn't think about it enough before I said yes, actually, to doing it. But yes, so these sensitivities are there, and we can't just go in with our big feet and push them aside. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Thank you.
Right, I think that my question kind of complements the question before, because I think that you both just about touched what I'm interested in. I'm a PhD student as well, and I research feminist photography in the context of sexual violence, and so I'm interested in all of this that you were talking about, and these so-called gender issues, and whether or not we input feminist values into the research. Isn't this something that we continue? How do we navigate that when a lot of these issues end up just being researched by women? Because if this is some, like, it is interesting for me, I'm super interested in this, I'm researching it, and when we look around, and the people that are actually doing this kind of research are by far women. And so, to complement your question before, which is, like, how do we do that holistically, but how do we even consider this when that kind of becomes then a niche? It becomes something that creates these things in academia in which, these are the women's spaces, and then you create these areas in which departments will be dominated by women. Certain departments will be dominated by women because of this kind of research. And so then it becomes this big elephant in the room. Like, how do we're talking about change, and we're talking about community, and we're talking about all of this, when we know that then how do we become a beacon to change that, when part of how we're doing this is contrived by and restricted by our gender?
I think that's a difficult one. I think most feminist research, whether it's done in Africa or North America, is done by women, because there's a big debate about whether men can actually understand women's lives. In the 19th century in the UK, they used to talk about fellow travellers, men who supported gender equality. I mean, they may have talked it beyond, but that's where I found it written about. Who supported women. So I think it's quite difficult. I remember that Barbara Castle, I wasn't old enough to actually hear her speech, but she got her maiden speech in Parliament when she was elected immediately after the Second World War was all about these torrid rows of male MPs who understood nothing about their women constituents. So I think that's been a constant theme within feminism, that the patriarchy is reinforced by men and women. We're born into a context where patriarchy still exists in the UK, and it just becomes part of our taken for granted. We all. I know I still do. I reflect on what I've done and I think, God, why did I do that? So I'm not. I find that one really difficult to answer. I mean, I can say that the research I did on unpaid care work and the findings did come up to be gender transformative, and the Rwandan government have taken them on board and have been working with the research team to think about how they can begin to implement them. The main researchers on that project were men. I mean, I had to write the questionnaires and all that sort of thing because they just didn't have the knowledge about it. And that's why I was asked by the organisation to become part of the research. So it wasn't my research project in that sense. So I think it's a really difficult one. I mean, I'm not sure I know the answer to it, and I think that what's happened in the UK is that feminist research is still done by women to a large extent, but it's become mainstream. So it's not seen as marginalized research done by women. It's seen as important research. And I think that's not only within academia, I think that's within policy as well. So I've forgotten, one of the female MPs was saying something about only women can understand something. I can't remember what it was. But that's just become part of what's seen. So I don't know. I don't think we can make men feminist. I might be wrong.
I think that's, you've covered it well. I can't add much to that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful, and I think that's we're unfortunately we'll have to wrap it up. I know that these are big questions and not easily answered, and I don't think we need to have all the answers. I think it's fine to continue to wrestle with these questions, these really good, important questions. I personally have found this discussion to be very much rooted in humility. It's been very accessible. I hope everybody in the audience has found it the same. I've really appreciated how what you've shared and the insights and the questions from the audience has engaged at different levels, from the policy level to the community to the individual, and as well a really nice mix of sort of theoretical approaches, thinking about vocabularies and epistemologies and how to make this research inclusive and transformative, but also practical, and how it's been so rooted in your own personal life and research experiences. So thank you. It's been an absolute privilege to be able to chair this session, and let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, and that concludes it for this evening.